this is going to be an interesting one to create a thumbnail for another one. And obviously you're going to have seen what it looks like, but as it stands right now, I have no idea. Before we begin, I just want to get some admin stuff out of the way. If you didn't see last Saturday's video, well, that was telling you that on Saturday the 29th of May, we will be having the release of the fourth and final book in the Ragnarök Chronicles 2016 series. That's the first series within the wider franchise, Tower of the Storm, and that'll be coming out in paperback and ebook as always from Amazon. We'll be having our live stream on that day as well from noon British Standard Time. All the details are in that video. I won't bog you down there. Go check it out if you want to find out more. Also, if you haven't seen the video on the Thursday before that, obviously that wasn't really a video. I didn't have time because I was busy with other stuff. I did mention in there that I might do a double upload some point to make up for the discrepancy in the schedule. I'll still mean to get to that. Haven't managed to do it this week, but it is in the pipeline to do. But on that note, this is the first proper Thursday video I've done since the Sleepy Hollow making a sequel of video, which, as always with those, as with every video, but with that series specifically, is always a lot of fun. Especially if you have seen the show Sleepy Hollow, please do check it out. Just let me know what you think. I think it's a good one. But with that, let's actually get on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where we talk about some of the lore of the books that I am writing. Now, in a previous video, I have talked about what I may refer to at this stage as the Calot system. Of course, it really shouldn't be called that. It would be like calling the solar system the Earth system or the Mars system. But let's call it one for now because Calot is the primary planet in terms of plot focus in those stories when we get to them. As I said in that intro bit, I'll leave the majority of the details up to that in the video if you want to go check it out. But to cover the basics again, this is a solar system in the centre of the universe where you have multiple stars, even more planets, and it is all able to function because it's contained within a spatial/temporal distortion that just allows for some wiggle room in what can be done by the laws of physics or otherwise, for instance. Now, if we're looking at the stories that are taking place on those worlds, one of the species that we might come across, although not on any of the worlds themselves, are the Maageqrue. Hence, this being the alien analysis of the Maageqrue as title, thumbnail, everything. If you've seen some of the alien analysis videos before, well, you'll kind of know what you're in for. If not, hopefully it's explanatory. I'm going to break it down. So I say that they're not really going to be seen on any of the planets themselves because the Maageqrue are outcasts. They are shunned by every society in the system, whether it's during a time of crisis and it's darker days and bad feelings all around, or even during peaceful times. There doesn't necessarily seem to be a reason behind this animosity. It's almost as though some time ago they might have been put under a curse, if you will, by some other more powerful cosmic entities that came into existence as a byproduct of that same spatial distortion due to their tangential involvement in some other events involving certain villains who, let's not bother getting into, but we can't know why this is the case, but indeed all of the major populations, those species on each of the worlds, they just have an innate negative reaction towards seeing any of this particular species, and as such they live almost entirely on their own spaceships. The only times they aren't on those ships is when they briefly go down to planets to take supplies, and as a result they in turn have a reputation amongst others, I guess, as being kind of like pirates, and that they plunder what they need, but again, from their point of view it's out of necessity and they do it as little as possible. Otherwise, other resources they try to be self-sustaining about, either on their ships or, for instance, they'll hide little facilities, like farms, I guess, as an example, within the asteroid belts and so forth, where, again, they might be come across, but it's less likely, and even in that possibility, that's why I specified hide them there. because this race is separate from all the other stuff that's going on each of the planets, they have missed out on some of the technical homogeny that's happened otherwise between the different societies. So they still have their own technologies. I mean, as I say, they're flying around in spaceships basically their entire lives. But it's comparatively unique compared to all of the other stuff that's going on in different species. Yes, those species will retain some of their own cultural identities and quirks about their artifacts and technologies and inventions, but there's then an underlying commonality between how certain systems are going to work and a shared scientific understanding of principles and so forth. Meanwhile, say the Maageqrue, as they go around in space, as well as just inherently coming through technological hurdles and discoveries on their own, they're also doing it within a much more concentrated exposure to the bizarreness of the space that the system is existing within. Yes, of course, everyone's technically within the system, and you do have enough research projects going out and studying, such as the temporal distortion itself, but that's still comparatively little compared to the Maageqrue, who are living their entire lives around all of this space. With this in mind, we can give an example of such a technology that is playing on the bizarreness of that reality in terms of their ships themselves. So if you would imagine a kind of large dish in front that has different panels on either side, with then on the rear a tether leading back to a smaller capsule. So this capsule here is where your actual Maageqrue crew are going to be inhabiting. The dish in front is purely for apparatus, there's no one inside of it. And how it then works is that the different panels, when activated, basically act like magnets for matter in general. So if you have your ship, say there's a planet over there, and they specifically want to turn towards it, they will activate the sections of the dish that are facing that planet, activate them. They then start being drawn towards the planet as a large mass in the way, may start to tilt, at which point the other panels can come online, so you have more attractiveness towards that location, starts moving forwards. Eventually they could shut that off and just go by their own momentum, but either way you have that. Just as much you can repel, so again, repulsive matter, they can go backwards, or they could use that again on the rear side of the dish for forward propulsion, although they want to be wary about that, because if they're repelling matter that's in the reverse direction, the main capsule is behind it as well, so they want to be careful about which way it's focused. How this is then controlled is that in the bridge, as it were, you have a suspended, smaller scale version of the ship, essentially, and then instead of the capsule at the end, you have this kind of rudder joystick that the pilot grabs a hold of, and they then basically can move it about at different angles to indicate which way they want the overall ship to be moving, and then they can move it forwards and backwards for intensity, they can twist it to talk about attraction or repulsion, any of that. How would this exactly work? A ship that is basically just attracted towards any matter that it happens to be facing towards? Again, that's really only because they are living inside of this cage, essentially. That's another aspect. They've been rejected by all of the people on the planets in the system. I'm sure the Maageqrue would be happy to leave and find other worlds that they could inhabit for themselves, but no. The spatial distortion locks everything inside. It's impossible for them to leave, but as a compromise, it grants them this oddity, as I've been saying, particularly, this is an example of. To talk about these actual aliens themselves, though, personally, you're looking at a bipedal creature. I would compare them to humans in terms of size, but there aren't any humans living in this system, so compared to your main protagonist species, to whom all of the scale is going to be compared to, they're slightly taller than that. Their main feature, though, is their very thick skin, this being extremely durable and protective. I mean, you can see this in terms of if you look at around their eyes or mouth or whatever it is, these features, these orifices, in each case appear sunken because the skin is actually thick enough that it extends beyond that. And it's thick to the extent that if any of them were to get internal injuries, or in sick in general, they have forms of medicine, although this is more going to be like traditional herbal medicines, for instance. Like, sickness is fine, but if you had an internal injury that, say, on Earth would necessitate invasive surgery, they can't do that. Unless, say, it's accessible through the mouth or some other opening. The effort that it would take to break through the skin, say if you need to do something with the ribs or the heart, that would be so damaging to the person to actually break through that you're probably not doing them any favours comparatively. So yeah, if they get internal bone breakages that can't be healed by the equivalent of a cast, or there's problems with the organs, that's kind of it for them. On the plus side, this does mean that they can't effectively be stabbed or shot at, again, unless you were to get into a weak point like eye, mouth, but we'll get to that in just a second. Before that, when we think about how thick all of this skin is, they do have two softer, weaker points, which are basically between their shoulders and their neck. The reason for these is that, in regards to their head, the back of which is completely hairless, the back plates of skin, it's possible, if say needed in close quarters combat, this can separate and through muscles and tendons basically swing around to become sort of like tusks. They're not sharp in any way, but they are toughened other protuberances that can come on either side of their face that, again, if they're really face to face with an opponent, can give them an extra means by which to inflict damage. This does obviously expose the back of the head. It's not the brain. The brain actually is only in the front half regardless, but also it's not just complete blood and everything else coming out. It is back there what you could basically say is their reproductive systems, although you wouldn't recognise it by anything that we would see on Earth. And the reason like that's there is for most of the time, therefore, rather than being exposed otherwise, the reproductive stuff is protected all behind this toughened rear of the skull. And even when it's exposed, because it's not like whenever they're fighting they're always going to do this, but if they were to create these kind of tusks, it does expose it. So that is in danger, but if they're going head on, it doesn't matter as much of what's behind. And also, in a more natural sense, in a natural environment, I mean, if they were, say, competing not out of like a battle or whatever, but more for a display for a potential mate, you then simultaneously have the show of strength against the rival, and also, more of your actual general display, potentially. But either way, the reason why you have the softened patches of skin here is, in theory, the neck should be long enough to have them swing around and everything is fine. Not that they're like giraffe necks or anything. They don't want to create too much of a vulnerable point on the neck anyway. But, because you can't guarantee that, what your body's going to do, just in case, or if maybe your neck's leaning to the sides or whatever, or your shoulders are hunched, as they come past, obviously it's not going to have complete divots like here, because then, well, I was originally going to have that, but then I didn't want to have to think about, do you have instead of a collarbone if you suddenly have complete gaps here and everything else, or neck muscles. So I said that instead, that if needs be, those parts can push down on the skin here as they then come forwards. I mentioned, obviously, well, in general, we're talking about combat there, but specifically if they were being attacked, stabbed, or shot at. Stabbed, pretty much they are immune to, therefore. Being shot, potentially, if you put enough force behind it, it could. I think we're talking about physical projectiles like bullets, like we have on Earth. But for the most part, again, they'd more be embedded rather than getting far enough in to actually cause internal damage. You could potentially use more like Sci-Fi laser fire or things like that. But again, as we'll get on to discussing a little later, that skin in turn is protecting them from radiations and energies to an extent. But with this in mind, we might start to be thinking, well, if they're that naturally defensive, why don't they just try to reclaim some land against the people who've rejected them on the planets? Well, just because they've got tough skin, they're not massively physically strong. They're not weak either. There's kind of a standard level of innate strength that obviously can go either way from individual to individual, but they're not like massively strong that they could just knock through all opponent soldiers. And in turn, you have the notion that because everyone has this negative reaction to seeing, not that as soon as someone's going to see them, they're going to immediately start launching and attacking them, but they're always, at the very least, unwelcoming to them. That if they were to try to force for themselves a peaceful existence on a planet, they would have to get rid of everyone who was already there. And that's not necessarily a pursuit that they're interested in doing, just in terms of effort and ethically. And finally, they do have a weak point, or weakness, rather, more accurately. Just as how certain colours can be a little bit painful to look at. I don't know if you do have people who are more severely affected by that sort of thing, potentially, but at the very least you can have some harsher hues from humans that you kind of want to look away from, some more glaring. To them, to the Maageqrue, there is a specific frequency of visible light which is, it's not going to blind them or kill them instantly, but very painful if it gets into their eye. Therefore, with this realised, again, those who don't want them around have worked out to set up systems where if it gets into a situation of being pillaged, they can shine these lights at the Maageqrue and they won't want to hang around for very long. That'll cause them quite probably to retreat soon enough. Just stepping back a second from an author standpoint rather than presenting this as fact, this element probably is the one that has the most potential to change by the time we get to writing these in the books, because again, these particular books where these characters show up is a way away. I was originally thinking that maybe it would be a sound, like a frequency of sound that they can't stand, but then maybe they could just build like ear protectors, to put it bluntly. And again, maybe here though they can still also create goggles that would block out that frequency. Again, I've kind of got away from that by saying that within their own understanding of science and so forth, they're not in a position where they will particularly pick up on the fact it's a specific frequency or have a notion of that concept and be able to filter it out. But even so, I don't know, potentially end up being something else. Do we even need a weakness at all? I'll throw this out to you guys. What do you think? Does it work that, yes, we should have, that there is a specific weakness to these creatures that isn't a physical attack per se, which then these other species have set up defences incorporating that thing? Or is it in fact enough to just say that in the face of having to wipe out everybody if they were to try to, settle down on actual physical planets, that's not something that they want to attempt, as I say, for the effort and for the ethics? Is that poignant, but is that substantial morally enough? We'll see again. Long time before these books, I can make a decision either which way, whenever in the intro. Another facet of this species that we can tie back to the skin, because we're going to keep on going to this, is to do with their clothing. Now, for the fact that they live basically all of their lives on spaceships, other than when they quickly pop down to the surface of planets when they need absolutely to get more resources of a certain type, they are living in artificial environments where temperature is balanced as it needs to be, so they don't need to be wearing clothes for warmth. And if we were thinking about modesty, potentially, again, first of all, not all species are going to have concepts of this, but also we've discussed how, in terms of reproductive systems, if that was going to be the main source of modesty, that's already, for the most part, sealed up in the backs of their heads. so they don't need to worry about that. So that's not a concern. Instead, clothing, or more broadly, that which they have on their body, comes down to utilities and items and tools. So what you may have is like this plates that go over like the front and backs of their torsos. You can have some on the limbs as well, but they're less common, it's more front and back. And upon these you would like hook on or attach by various means any kind of items that the given Maageqrue is taking around with them. So again, this could be for general engineering, it could be a computer device, it could be just a keepsake thing, whatever it is, that's how they carry those, rather than having bags or anything like that. How we then have these like plates, harnesses attached, is that they are connected up by this netting that then goes around the rest of their body. I set up the notion before that their skin protects them somewhat from heat and radiation and so forth. This is where we could talk about that slightly more, although it doesn't need to be said in too much detail, where, for instance, for us as humans, if say you have a laptop, really you should have it on a lap tray or something like that. You shouldn't put it directly on your lap, whatever it is, because of the heat it outputs. In that sort of situation, like if they had a machine that they are putting on their plates, it could be active and running, doing stuff as they're walking around. They don't have to worry about the fact that they, in theory, have heat output of that device going straight into them, because again, skin is thick enough that it mostly, protects them from the majority of that. Their actual insides are fine. Also, the reason why it's netting that's attaching these harnesses rather than still solid garments underneath is that they want a certain amount of their skin to be visible because of the markings upon it. Just as how we have unique fingerprints, they have unique markings across the body, which is what they use for identification. Now, yes, obviously, people look different. You have twins and so forth, or specifically identical twins, but even then, like, they have different fingerprints, so these ones would have different markings. But either way, more than just going by general appearance, the significance of this is that they use these markings to recognise each other because they don't have names, which is going to make it interesting to write relating to these characters. But, I mean, it's going to end up being a situation probably like where in the show Stargate Atlantis, Shepard gave names to the wraiths, like Todd, because they didn't have names themselves. You have here the character of, well, as I mentioned in the previous video about the Calot system, you have the character of Remy, whose name is probably going to end up changing before we get to the actual books, but for now that's what I'm referring to him as. Like, he'll probably end up giving any of the Maageqrue that are interacted with where it's necessary, give them names to refer to them by, but they don't have that kind of communication. No, instead, peculiarly, they have an instinctive awareness of what everyone in their species needs, what they're doing, or not in any specific detail. They can't say, oh, this person over there is specifically saying this and doing this and completely other part of space, but they are aware that, like, if there was an issue detected in one part of the ship and another person who would be, the most proficient at dealing with it is somewhere else, they would just inherently know that they need to go and fix the issue in third location. So they have a constant awareness of everyone in their people, what should be done and how they should cooperate. And as such, as a species, despite the fact, or the reason they don't have language is they don't need it, they never have, they are naturally cooperative by some unknown mechanism. They always know what's needed for either the collective or just for one other individual, to which the experience of it would be kind of like how, unless you are visually impaired or missing the nose, I guess, potentially have an extremely small nose, technically you could always see your nose. But because this is unchanging information, it's not information that you need, unless you're specifically focusing on it, your brain edits out that information. You don't need to see it. It's also how blind spots works, like the exact point on the retina where the optic nerve connects. You're not receiving any light there, so there should be a blank spot in your vision, but the brain fills in the rest of the information. It determines what you need to see, what you don't need to see. In this case, they have an awareness technically of everything that's going on, but their brains process it such that they're only consciously aware of the stuff that might potentially relate to them, that would dictate what should they go and do now, or how should it impact their behaviour. The reason why this whole process that connects them all is absolutely mysterious is that because all the other races keep on shunning them, none of the Maageqrue have ever been studied to a sufficient extent that the scientific community can work out what's going on. There has been enough determined that they can say it's not strictly telepathy, it's also not a hive mind, and it's not all mind hive. They can rule that out, but still the rest is rather obscure. Now, even if, say, the curse that has this species being inherently rejected by anyone else was to be lifted, that's not to say that everyone else would suddenly just greet them with open arms and apologise for everything that's gone on, whatever. And just because you would get rid of the active cause for negativity, these people have still been conditioned to have a negative response to the sight of the Maageqrue. They're still going to react the same way, even if they don't have to, upon being around them. However, removing the impetus would at least create the potential for, down the road, getting over this predisposition and being more open to considering them. That would be quite a way to go, though. At the time of the books, the only character who could potentially try to steer towards that straight away would be Remy, again, because he does have, for reasons that are not specified in these videos, I don't think I said in the previous one either, because it keeps some things to discover in the books themselves, but he has a different way of perceiving what's going on in the Calot system. So he's going to notice the issues already with how the Maageqrue are treated, especially already, with how difficult it would be to actually fatally injure one of the Maageqrue. If that does happen, sometimes you might have people taking trophies from that, and as such, you may end up having one separate character having killed a Maageqrue, fashioning protective garments out of that skin. Kind of like how you can create crocodile skin handbags and so forth, but again, there's protective stuff because thick substance. And everyone else will totally be fine with that. Because again, that's an impressive thing. You took one down, they're bad species, we don't want any of their sort, and that's a mark of your achievement and also a smart thing to do with it, because you've now got something that's positive lingering on afterwards. And only Remy, to begin with at least, would very much see a problem with this. But either way, open doors, and this is all hypothetical anyway, that there might at some point be a change in the Maageqrue's condition. For now, though, they have to stick with just travelling around in their ships, only coming down to the planets when they need to. Hopefully you have found that interesting. If you did, as I've mentioned, we do have a couple of other videos of this sort about other species within the Ragnarök Chronicles, and in a few seconds there'll be a playlist annotation available for you to click on to see some of that. It's within a wider playlist, more just generally to do with people and species. Maybe if I do enough of these alien analyses videos, they'll have their own specific playlist, but not at the moment as it stands as release of this one. Either way, you can check out those. How do these compare, these different species that I've spoken about thus far? Has listening to this given you any inspiration for stuff of your own, or do you have your own species, fantasy or science fiction or whatever in general that you want to discuss? You can talk about it in the comment section down below. As I mentioned before, you also have what would you think about the rationale behind the Maageqrue not actively attacking more often? What works better in your mind as an audience, as a reader? In these videos, I may end up conveying similar sentiments anyway, but regardless, I try to stay away from saying this specifically. Just whatever reason in my own head, I feel like, it's just so much the cliche thing, and you have to say it's artificially to try to game the system, but let's have a go at it this time, considering that I've been talking about comments already that you can potentially leave. Well, of course, any video you can leave comments if you want to react to what I've said or have your own stuff to contribute to. If you have liked this video, you can always like, comment, and subscribe to help me in the algorithm, because I'm really what the algorithm is going to be paying attention to. But say, like the video if you did like it, comments, already suggested stuff, or you can, of course, say whatever you like if you want, and subscribe to make sure that you see other videos on the channel. Either way, always link on the Twitter and Facebook. Usually, links for those down in the description below. Regardless, there will be videos talking about the Ragnarök Chronicles of various sorts for you to see when you want to check them out. And until then, whatever it is that you're choosing to do, the main thing is to always remember to keep on telling stories.